I don't know about you, but I thought this morning was very powerful, and I was quite moved, actually, and now a little bit lost for words, but this is going to be just as significant, I think, this panel. We're going to talk about social movements and pressure for change, and we know that people-powered social movements have changed the world, sometimes in very obvious ways, sometimes by slowly changing a culture, and it tends to creep up on us until we wonder what all the fuss was about. But the fuss was what brought about the change, and it was people who caused the fuss. Some global examples we'll all be familiar with: Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, and Greta Thunberg and her strike from school for the climate. But to that we can and must add the decades of fuss made by people here, which resulted in a peace process. It has inspired others around the world. I've met quite a few people around the world with my work, and they all mention the peace process, not always the individuals who brought it about, and I think that perhaps needs to change. But what unites them all, it seems to me, is that they grew those movements because of people ready to defend and claim rights, not just for themselves, but for others. And social movements for change nearly all start from a small place with a very few individuals with the vision, courage, and determination to push it. And then thereafter to be relentless when others grew tired, disenchanted, or pressurised. So even if we don't know how, we have all benefited from social movements, and thanks to the people like those who are going to speak to us today. Now, I'm not going to indulge myself and say any more because it's not absolutely, you don't need to hear from me today. But I do want to pay tribute to them because they have been an inspiration and they're heroes of mine, each one of them. So let's move straight to them. I'll introduce each speaker. But I have to confess at the outset there is simply not enough time to even give you an overview of their achievements. I'm going to be very short, but I think you know them all already. But I'm going to start with Avila Kilmurray. Avila has worked in the community sector and philanthropy in Northern Ireland for decades, even though she looks so young. During that time, she's become known to and revered by almost everyone. Just to give you a very brief a taste of what she's done. She's a particular interest in women's issues and anti-poverty work, and has seen that through all of those decades. She was a founder member of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. She was director of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, which prioritised support for community action and peace building, and is currently, among many other things, the Migration and Peace Building Executive at the Social Change Initiative, a role which supports work with the Migrant Learning Exchange Programme and learning on peace building. And if that wasn't enough, she's also written brilliantly on the contribution that philanthropy can make to social justice, peace building and conflict transformation. So we're all very fortunate to have her share some of her thoughts with us today. So Avila Kilmurray.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. And I was just saying there, I think it was very hard to follow that last panel. And also, I think, because I sort of struggled with the title we've been given around social movements and pressure for change, because I suppose, you know, the theory of social movements would suggest that they're informal networks, that they're based on shared belief and solidarity, that they mobilise around issues that are contested issues or conflictual issues, and they adopt a range of different forms of protest. And I suppose that, you know, the social movement, if we're thinking in terms of the troubles of the peace process, was the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement. And I'm not going to say anything about that because I'm too young, and Bronagh and Tom were both involved in it, so they can speak from personal experience. But what I do want to talk about, and I was just trying to sort of piece together something, was really some of this, and whether there were sectors or social movements I sort of struggled with, but I think there probably were social movements in terms of the community movement and the women's movement in Northern Ireland. And one of the things that I feel quite strongly, and the point was made just before we broke up there, you know, is there so much unwritten or unrecorded history here? You know, it tends to be the high politics rather than actually what kept people going over so many decades. And I actually got annoyed about it back in sort of 2008, 2009, because so many experienced community activists, they were dying. And their stories had never been recorded. So I went and I recorded 120 interviews with community activists, and it was just such a rich history that really was never reflected. So I went back over some of those transcripts for today, and what I pulled out of it in terms of, I suppose, social movements, or however you want to describe them, was almost three specific categories. I mean, first of all, the movements that very intentionally focused on the ongoing politics, on the conflict. So you had, obviously, the peace people back in the 1970s. You had the sort of community relations type movement, again made up of a lot of individual organisations, going from sort of big ones like sort of Corrymeela that have been around for so long, to things like the Cornerstone community, Fort Spring, and so forth. But generalised, you know, a sort of a movement. And then more recently, well, in the sort of period of the as a backdrop, if you like, to the peace talks in the 1990s. You had the Northern Ireland Council of Voluntary Action bringing together the sort of the trade union movement, the employers' bodies, the rural, the farmers' organisations, and the voluntary sector in a sort of a consultative forum, which I always sort of said, you know, acted almost like as a cheerleader for the peace process, and was actually very important. But then we had a whole selection of organisations and sectors which probably, you know, did form a sort of a movement that tended to focus on non-troubles related issues, whether it was poverty, whether it was women's issues or community issues, but were actually quite intentional about being cross-community and outreach. And again, there we would have had, and I'll talk a bit more about it, the Women's Information Day network that met sort of once a month for well over a decade, bringing people together. With the trade union movement, that I'm sure Tom will talk more about. And we had the early community movement, the CONI, the Communities Organisations of Northern Ireland, and a number of different networking approaches. And to an extent, and it's one of the things that I think we really have lost, certainly in the sort of the 70s, 80s, we had an adult education movement that was outside the colleges. That was really important because it actually gave people time to reflect and to exchange in terms of what was going on. And the third category then that I sort of identified were those movements that questioned conditions, sought to look for public policy change and so forth, but very deliberately did not engage with the troubles-related politics. A lot of the voluntary sector would fall into that category. And I think for many years, and I remember it being particularly a discussion within the trade union movement, there was then this sort of range, spectrum of approaches between being non-sectarian, we are non-sectarian, we have room for everybody, and being anti-sectarian. And again, probably the late 1980s in terms of the trade union movement, that shift tended to happen very deliberately. We also had that sort of, within, I suppose, our social movements, a wee bit of, you know, that song title of whatever you say nothing, because it's the only way actually to keep going and looking for change without actually dividing people. And actually going back to sort of, you know, the early 1980s, almost this sort of sense that if you said something that was anyway sort of controversial or reflecting on the current situation, you were the problem. I always remember I started my work in Derry back in the 70s, but coming up to Belfast, I'm working with the Northern Ireland Council for Social Services then, which became the Northern Council for Voluntary Action. And we had a newspaper cutting service for our members about issues. And I remember I was in charge of it for my sins. I started to cut out newspaper items about the prisons. And I was hauled over the coals for actually, you know, introducing something that really should not be introduced in the community and voluntary sector. So again, if you did anything, you were seen as actually the problem. And I think the other contextual thing in terms of looking at social movements and change was our timeline. I mean, again, in the 1970s, we had that international influence of movements coming in, and obviously sort of the impact of the civil rights movement. But then we also had, by the late 70s, that increased binary between them and us. You know, so the sort of the early community movement was able to sort of garner that sort of working class issues. But increasingly then with residential segregation, it became more and more difficult in terms of keeping that together. And then in the 1980s, again, because of the situation, an increase in the number of issue-based movements, and some that were intentional in terms of community outreach. But even with something like the women's movement, which again had a whole range of issues that it was working around, there was an element within it that people were also there to convince others of a politics. In fact, I remember, and Bronagh will remember this, it got so bad at one point that we had to have unity meetings on a Saturday morning in order to try and keep the women's movement from splintering because of the politics. And the unity movements, I think, invariably ended up in some local pub. And then we had a completely different atmosphere in the sort of post-1994 ceasefire period. And I was director of the Northern Ireland Voluntary Trust, which became Community Foundation for Northern Ireland at the time. And we put out a survey to about 900 community-based groups in November, December 1994 to ask people what were the issues that were important to them. And the ones that came back were at the top of the list were issues around civil liberties, human rights, depending on which side of the community that was coming back from, and the political issues. They wanted to see a settlement. It was about jobs, job creation, economic development. It was about support for community infrastructure, for social issues, and then it talked about specific groups like victims and survivors and political prisoners and so forth. Those were the sort of issues, much broader than what we actually ended up in many ways discussing at the peace talks. And arguably, I think, since the Good Friday Agreement, over the last certainly 20 years, we've seen a retrenchment. You know, what was more of a movement or movements, whether it's community movement or women's movement or whatever else, has tended to become more of a sector. Partially, I think, because of the way it is seen and funded by statutory agents. You know, where groups are almost put up in competition with one another, and it's short-term, and it's project-based, rather than having the room for the networking and the broader social movement. And again, I mean, you know, even the trade union movement, you know, which when by about 1988, 89, was, you know, setting up Counteract as an anti-intimidation unit, was mobilising people at points during the conflict onto the streets to say enough is enough. It's, you know, whenever the violence was in danger of spiralling over even into more severe forms, it too has become much quieter in terms of, you know, its role and what it can do. So the issue, I think, for the movements that fell into my first category, into the ones that were intentionally taken on the politics, was that they found it very difficult, something like the peace people, for argument's sake, because immediately the political entities started saying, well, where's your politics? What's your hidden agenda? You know, are you a front for the British state or whatever else? So I think it was very, very difficult for them. And I always remember, you know, when the peace people were saying that they were about peace, immediately sort of Republicans were coming back and saying, but peace with justice. So you're into almost like the terminology of where did you stand. And I think that by the time we got to the 1990s, with the different scenario, it was then easier for groups to start looking at the possibility of supporting a political settlement, political change in the context of the ceasefires. But while the violence was going on, it was very difficult for groups to be intentionally looking at the politics. And the other thing that I think that we had, particularly in the community movement, was sort of that sort of networking, that attempt to network across our various divides, really became quite fractured in terms, again, of the sort of that binary them and us situation. So we had the communities of organisations in Northern Ireland, which was very successful for quite a period of time. But then on the other hand, we had the Ulster Community Action Group being set up in the aftermath of the UWC strike, which was very much a loyalist community entity. So, you know, so it was difficult to actually try and keep that sort of cross-community approach. And I think it was Jackie, actually, there was also a situation, even within Coney, within the broader community movement, where actually it was mainly the nationalist Republican communities that were there. The conference in Magee, where Paddy Doherty, the late Paddy Doherty in Derry, at one point wrote on the blackboard, "Where are the prods?" Jackie was there. But apart from that, and actually I remember talking to the late Lenny Parr about that, and he sort of said, yeah, but the problem was we were up against it, because if we were critical, we were being told by our politicians, you're being anti-state. And if you're anti-state, then you're a traitor. So it was more difficult. By the early 1980s, we had an increase in locally based organisations, but again, as I say, divided by residential segregation. And I mentioned the Women's Information Group because it was interesting, because it was about women's issues. I remember they actually barred any academic coming in to talk to them on the basis that they were off-putting, and and it was up to the women themselves to decide what issues they wanted to talk about and to sort of lead the discussion. And initially, and it was made up of women's groups from all over Belfast, Greater Belfast, and they were brought together by Kate Kelly, who was a community worker. But initially, they met in a place like this, in central Belfast. Again, on the basis it was non-aligned, non-sectarian. But the interesting thing about that movement was that the women themselves, after about 6 months, just out of curiosity, said, actually, we want to rotate our meetings between a nationalist Republican community this month, a loyalist Protestant community that month, and that's what they did. And they did that because, again, they were being told, oh, they're getting everything, you're getting nothing. And they wanted to see if that was true. And while it didn't talk about the big politics with the big P, and we used to talk about politics with a big P and politics with a small p, they actually, it humanized in many ways the experience of people living in different divided communities. But when I say it was an intentional cross-community movement, it was because the then organiser of it, a woman from Kathleen Feenan, used to tell me, well, I engaged in the politics of the apple tart. So if I was at the meeting on March and I noticed that there was nobody there from Newton Abbey or whatever else, I bought an apple tart and I knocked at their door and they had to invite me in for a cup of tea. And I actually just sat down with them and said, why couldn't you come? Now, it could have been, that they didn't have childcare or whatever else, or whatever it was, or the bus didn't turn up. But equally, it could have been because, a bit like Alan's story, that they'd been told not to go or whatever else. So it wasn't just a matter of providing a space and an invitation and waiting for people to come. It was also just keeping an eye, who's not there, why are they not there, and let's do something about it. And with that group, and it did use a variety of tactics. I always remember it was a period for Maggie Thatcher was in Parr, and they decided they'd go over and present a petition in Downing Street. But again, what they did was, rather than getting the most articulate or the most confident, they put all the names in a hat and pulled out 6 names. And actually the women that ended up going had never been on a plane before, whatever. But again, it was very much all the time, how can we be inclusive in such a way that it's not an elite and everybody else. And they also played to one another's strengths, because I always remember a picket that they had up in Stormont. And it was agreed that the women's groups from the Falls would make the banners, because they were quite good at that, and the women's groups from Tullycarnish would get the police permission. So again, to actually sort of say, well, where was it, who could do what? So they got to know each other, and as I say, while big politics was not specifically on the agenda, over tea or coffee at the sides, you could see people talking about their stories, what had happened to them, whether the week before or the month before or whatever. And then what we had, I think, for a period, and it sort of almost grew, because people were working together around issues, around women's issues or whatever else, we had and Cynthia Coburn wrote a book about it in about 1994, where she was looking at women's sector in Northern Ireland, in Bosnia, and in the Middle East. And she called it, big term, transversal politics. But actually what it was was people that through their sort of social change, social action milieus and relationships, actually sort of working together, sharing their differences, but respecting the difference, which was quite a development on from sort of more the early 80s, where it was much more trying to win the argument. It was actually saying, no, there are differences here, and we have to respect them. A lot of these, I suppose, developments, a lot of these experiences were actually what fueled the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. And we deliberately called it a coalition, not a party, to actually make the point that it was not just another party, it was about doing politics differently. And actually, it was from my experience in the trade union movement. I was women's officer with what was then the Amalgamated Transport and General Workers Union, Unite, which actually was an all-island region because it was pre-partition. In the north, it would have been probably about 2/3 a Protestant membership at the time. And again, we were dealing sometimes with very divisive issues. I remember motions going to Congress around, say, strip searching and things like that, that could have literally sort of split my Women's Committee. And what we learnt was the importance of bringing things back to a value base, not starting in terms of a social movement with the issue, the divisive issue, but actually saying, well, what are our values? Okay, are we all about human rights? Are we all about equality, whatever else? And we could then have that discussion, starting from the values and then saying, so we have this issue. How do we then look at that? And we did the same with the Women's Coalition. We had, we didn't have rakes of policies, beyond the ones that Bronagh wrote. We had 3 principles, though, which were human rights, equality, and inclusion, that we talked to everyone. And we learnt that from experience in the trade union movement, experience the women's movement, experience in the community movement. And the other thing that we brought in was the importance, and was referred to a bit earlier, was the importance of recognising the role of representative democracy, but that's not enough. And particularly it's not enough in a contested society where so many people actually ended up as community activists or in women's groups or whatever else because they had actually been turned off from the politics. So there was a huge experience there, and that's why we put so much emphasis on participative democracy and the idea of a civic forum. As you know, it was set up and ran for a period, but is no longer in place. And arguably, while it's referred to, I think, was it 6 people, then it really needs to be properly re-envisaged, but there's a role for it. So my time is over, but perhaps the other two last points. The other movement, I think, that we saw that actually gained experience, insights from what had gone before was the campaign, the Yes campaign, that Quintin Oliver set up, but that actually drew in that civic society. And again, while we sort of celebrate, whatever you want to call it, the Good Friday Agreement, we sort of forget that was a hard-fought campaign. That, it wasn't a sort of a tick-box exercise that we sometimes think about. And lastly, I suppose, well, 2 things. First of all, I think what we are seeing now is social movements around identity issues, not just the sort of the Northern Ireland politics, but obviously the LGBT issues, environmental issues, and so forth. But one of the challenges I think that we now have is to build solidarity between the various social movements that are happening. Because there's a danger that if we are actually too purist in terms of demands around specific social movements, that we exclude others. And the other point that I feel strongly about is that we no longer have the investment in sort of networks, and those broader initiatives that actually can bring people together. We tend to be more focused on sort of the micro, on local communities or specific issues. And it was the networking aspect that actually turned individual organisations into something like a movement. Thank you.
think to speed things up, I'll just stay where I am and introduce Bronagh Hinds. Thank Avila, and then do you want to? So, just by way of short introduction, Bronagh has a long, distinguished career and track record campaigning for peace, democracy, human rights, and equality, both here and beyond. Now, she has held far too many positions to list them, but I'll reference a couple. Deputy Chief Commissioner of the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland Commissioner in the UK Women's National Commission, Commissioner in the Local Government Staff Commission. She's Chair of the Institute of British Irish Studies, University College Dublin, and a board member of the Glen Cree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. She's a Senior Associate, currently with Democracy. I think she's being too modest. I think you set it up, didn't you? Which encourages young women to elevate their voices through self-advocacy, civic engagement, community building, thereby hopefully ensuring more and more women like Bronagh, like Avila, will be empowered to follow her example. So thank you, Bronagh.
Thanks, Alyson. It's great to be here and to see a conference that's really focusing on civil movements and civil society's contribution to peace building. And I'm not going to try and do what Avila did, and she's stolen a lot of the issues, so maybe I'll just flesh it out with a number of examples. But one of the things that I think we should think about, and I remember someone that I worked with a long time ago from Derry said to me he was taking a sabbatical to travel the world to find out more about community development in other places. And what he found out is that we had more of it in Northern Ireland per square mile than anywhere else in the whole world. And actually, that has been, in a sense, our saving grace in Northern Ireland. And we lose that active citizenship at our peril. And I think it has very deep roots here, because it's embedded, as the examples that Avila has given you, for example, the Women's Information Group, it's bedded right into communities. And even though it's a collaboration from that with grassroots women through middle class women, from business, trade union, community and voluntary sector, women and men across the community and voluntary sector, we forget about those deep roots at our peril, and sometimes it's very easy for people to dismiss it as the elite speaking, particularly politicians, when they don't like to hear what we are saying in terms of people's needs or moving forward. The other thing I'd say is that to speak about any dozen of the initiatives that we have in Northern Ireland is a very rich picture indeed, never mind the multiples of dozens that we have, and that it's not just Belfast based, but it's right across Northern Ireland. So let me just follow a few strands through to talk about some of the practical things that people have done. We know very much about the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. Of course, we could start with the students' movement and the students campaigning for change. We could talk about the People's Democracy Movement. I myself, like many others, were involved in the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. I served on the executive for a period, but I was one of those that set up the branch in Queen's University as people's democracy was fading and civil rights was growing. And of course, we can talk about all of those demonstrations with thousands of people on the street. Actually, when you think back, the opposition to that was quite extraordinary, because what we were talking about was basic human respect, decency and human rights for absolutely everyone. And I think that would be recognised now. I'm thinking of Bloody Sunday, and then I'm thinking of what happened after Bloody Sunday when we went on the march to Newry, and there were upwards of 50,000 people there from all parts of this island and further afield. So many people marching down round the Derrybeg estate. But I think particularly rich is the women's movement. And the first women's movement was set up here, really radical movement, alongside the civil rights movement some years afterwards, but it was the Northern Ireland women's rights movement that a number of us set up in the 1970s. I know some people just wanted to focus on civil rights, but I think it was really important to have a parallel women's rights movement. When we think of what that spawned, For example, the first women's centre, which was called the Downtown Women's Centre, right in the centre of Belfast. Out of that sprang lots of other women's groups and women's centres that expanded. We had what we called the Women's Education Project. We had the Rape Crisis Centre came out of that. We had lots of different things. And indeed, as Avila referred to, there was a lot of falling out. It was the time when there was lots of definitions of what feminism was and whether men were or were not allowed to be part of a women's rights movement. And there were so many battles. And in fact, that's why we called together the Unity Movement. And actually, I would argue that it was that movement that women did in the 1970s and early 80s, all that falling out, coming back together, and that rich movement meant that when we got to the time of founding the Women's Coalition, people had been through all those battles, made all those connections, had all those networks, suffered all that pain, and worked on the ground with each other. And therefore, that made it easy for us to mobilise at that time with less effort than would have been needed. I'm even thinking about the piece of work the Women's Education Project transformed into the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and I'm thinking to the work that they did on women's citizenship when nobody was looking at women's citizenship. Women's information groups have been mentioned. And then groups like Clarnaman in West Belfast was looking at a women's agenda for peace and having discussions in West Belfast, at the same time as the Northern Ireland Women's European Platform was doing a lot of work mobilising women in Northern Ireland. We were working, I suppose, as was through the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action, we would say the forerunners of some of the stuff that came into the agreement. We were working on a north-south basis, on an east-west basis, with partners in Scotland, Wales, England, and the south of Ireland. We established the European Women's Lobby. So not only were women setting up local women's groups and taking action in women's rights here, but they were building trust across communities, but we were building those interjurisdictional relationships, and we were organising joint events. And more than that, we were elevating the issues up into the EU and up into the UN. For example, I remember representing the Women's European Platform at a UN meeting and getting Northern Ireland and references to Northern Ireland and peace into the UN agenda at that point in the 1990s. Particularly collaboration on this island with the National Women's Council of Ireland, which we were able to do within the EU framework, which was extremely helpful. I want to refer here particularly also to a piece of work that the OPSAL Commission did, which was a seminal piece of work, 554 submissions, engaging over 3,000 people in the debate, having public hearings, and challenging people. Of course, there were some private hearings, but challenging people on their views to bring out the OPSAL report. And I know Andy Pollock is here, as well as Marion Elliott. And I remember the second year of that, we spent the year going around creating awareness from that project, speaking in all sorts of meetings, but also engaging with governments to get some of the concepts and ideas into the thinking. And if you just think of that one concept, parity of esteem, that came out of those thinking of the OPSAL Commission. You have to work very hard in a civil society movement to get the odd phrase and words into anything, as we found when we were negotiating the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. But that collaboration, we took the women's contributions, which were very much highlighted in the OPSAL Commission, and brought women down to Dublin to share those experiences with all the member organisations of the National Women's Council of Ireland. We started moving from women's rights to talking about women's opportunities at the table, putting out statements around the Downing Street Declaration, joint statements with the National Women's Council of Ireland and the Northern Ireland Women's European Platform, around those days. We ran a large... we had meetings in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin. We had meetings up in Belfast with policymakers here. In fact, we had Stormont opened for us, where we had a big debate in the Senate chamber in Stormont. And we ran the first ever large North-South Women's Conference held in the US residency in Dublin, where we put on the agenda, as we were coming up towards, people were talking about moving towards a peace process, so we put on the agenda women's participation and economic and social investment in women, trying to run those two lines so that women would be invested in from the EU and also would not be forgotten about in the process, and of course made submissions to the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. And I could track that right through to work beyond that. After the agreement, you know about the Women's Coalition, so I'll not do that. The Northern Ireland Women's platform engaged with the Northern Ireland office to ensure that women could get into those negotiations. But moving forward, we then set up democracy, and believe it or not, trained women in every single political party, every single one, anti-agreement as well as pro-agreement parties, in terms of trying to get more women into the Assembly, and then moved in to work with local government on women in local councils, because we were absolutely sure if we could get greater diversity and a greater mix, and particularly more women in the room, that would make a better contribution to peace. But it would be wrong to not talk about all the other initiatives, civil society initiatives. I'm thinking about some of the people are always critical of the churches, and I would be myself in many cases in terms of the leadership during the peace process, but let's not forget about some particular people like Jerry Reynolds and Ken Newell from Fitzroy Presbyterian and Clonard Monastery, who held encounter meetings between people, or the evangelical contribution of Northern Ireland, Connal, who really wanted to remove the clutches of evangelicalism being used as a political weapon, and had very open discussions. I've mentioned the wonderful Upsal Commission, but also things like democratic dialogue, which then spawned New Agenda, which was an attempt to bring the business community and trade union sectors together, working together, with a kind of an undercurrent of the peace process and a political process. Avila referred to the education sector. I was director of the Ulster People's College, and Paul Nolan was director of the Workers' Education Association. And I remember, if you remember, Conway Mill in West Belfast came under enormous pressure, particularly from the British government, thinking it was a haven for the IRA and wanting to withdraw funds from any organisation that was working there. But the Workers' Education Association, despite its funds being cut for its programmes there, continued to provide education classes in West Belfast, in Conway Mill. In the Ulster People's College, we ran had a community leadership programme, really bringing together to plan education, not just deliver education, but to plan programmes right across different communities. And you would be surprised who was in the room in that discussion, in those discussions, and then who did exchange visits, who had never met each other, or that our programmes were based around culture, identity, history, community relations, rights, justice, equality. And those were the issues that were being discussed about in both sides of the community. Or that the Ulster People's College provided the first training to the DUP to understand what civil rights was about. Yes, had to be done in DUP headquarters. And obviously, behind the scenes, a venue for behind the scenes, some track to engagement on the political scene. But we forget also the work that was done in just providing neutral venues and safe spaces for people to meet. We have the projects that worked on the interfaces. I'm thinking of Springfield Inter-Community Development Project and the Interface Belfast, who, if you remember, at times of great tension, had mobile phone networks operating across the community and community leaders stepping up in order to try and relieve tensions. And one, I think, of particular note that hardly gets a mention is community dialogue, which still exists on a shoestring. And I agree with Avila. We miss the projects like the Ulster People's College or the Workers' Education Association, and something like community dialogue should be more. And the Lynn Hall Library is doing a good deal of this in terms of having educational debates. But as the process was moving in the political process, we set up community dialogue to actually take those very difficult issues, to translate them into ordinary everyday terms and produce simple leaflets on them with the questions about, to have single identity discussions in different communities before people came together, whether it was on power sharing, whether it was on release of prisoners, whether it was something else, in order to say, what do you want? What do you need, and what do you live with, given that others have to have things to meet their needs too? So I think all of those initiatives are extremely important, and we sometimes forget that even though we have this rich strand of community and voluntary sector, there have always been specific initiatives developed to actually try and engage with the peace process, either explicitly or in some kind of undercurrent. I think we need to be very clear that the peace process actually belongs to people. It's not, doesn't belong to the politicians. And I think people on the ground, I think, have always been ahead of politicians, and that necessarily hasn't been demonstrated or listened to in terms of the political leadership messages which are given. The politicians were engaged in a political process, and I was very struck, as I'm sure Avila and others in the Women's Coalition were. We talk about the three strands in the agreement: strand 1, strand 2, strand 3, 1 being internal, 2 being north-south, 3 being east-west. But when I reflect back, I'm now reflecting back on 3 in a different way. First of all, there's the power and the institutions. And guess what? The politicians were mostly focused their attention first on the power and the institutions. That's not unusual. It happens in other conflicts as well. You know, who's going to have power? Are we going to have any power? How is the institutions going to protect us to make sure we can maintain our political leadership and our vote? The second, of course, were the security issues around policing, reform, prisoners, decommissioning. Of course, that had to be dealt with. I have to say we have not dealt with decommissioning very well. In those days, we just talked about decommissioning. Now, in international terms, you'd talk about disarmament, demobilisation and reintegration, and we really haven't addressed that issue well. But that really affected the men who were carrying the guns and that channel. But then the third set of issues, and I would argue that those were the issues that civil society and women brought to the table. There were organisations like the Committee on the Administration of Justice arguing from the outside, and the Women's Coalition were the bearers of a lot of those issues about human rights, about equality, about integrated education, mixed housing. Avila's referred to the Citizens' Assembly that we argued for, and of course victims and survivors. But you will see references in the agreement, if you look at it, about social inclusion, community development, as well as the advancement of women in public life. All of those that have had minor attention, but all of the ones that we would have said speak to everyday life and people, and actually in the longer term, we're talking about the legacy of the past and moving forward to the future. And I would say those are the most difficult issues that we really had to deal with and still have to deal with, because they are the ones that have not had the attention that they deserved. They're the civil society issues. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Bronagh. And we're going to hear next from Jackie Redpath. Jackie is a man who's dedicated his life to championing the protection and empowerment of others. He's always identified needs within the community and then sought to address them. His community development work has stretched into cross-community, cross-border and international work for peace and understanding. He has significant and long-standing experience addressing the issue of educational underachievement, which he's still working on. He played an important role in the early stages of the Northern Ireland peace process and was awarded the American Ireland Fund Leadership Award. He's received an MBE for service to the community and an honorary degree from his old University of Queen's, currently Chief Executive of the Greater Shankill Partnership. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's good to be here, and thanks for the invite to speak to you. And I'm aware I'm only the only thing to stand between you and hearing Tom, so I'm going to be as short as I can. But I did think it was a lovely thing that Connal had mentioned May Blood and the sending out the stuff about today, and important that she's acknowledged. I've been fortunate only temporarily to get a box of her stuff, and it will be going to the Lynn Hall Library, because May, at the end of her days, was still involved with the Early Years Project on the Shankill as chair of it, the Sure Start Early Years Project, and she had a desk there from the mid-1990s through. So I got hold of a box of stuff, her stuff, after her departure, and it was interesting. One of the things lying at the bottom of it, because it had been gathered up, this wasn't framed, it was the letter from Tony Blair appointing her to the House of Lords. And I'm sure those that work there in the Women's Coalition might know she never had the highest regard for Tony for some reason. But that letter of her appointment didn't get framed. It was in the box. But here's what was on top of the box, was this thing in her own handwriting, and I pulled it out last night. And it was a speech she must have been making somewhere, and she had written out in her own hand, "The purpose of a good education is simple. It should enable a child to become the author of the story of their life." This project will give that will give that to them. And she was talking there about early years and Sure Start, but I thought I would travel a long way before getting as good a definition of what education ought to be about than what she said. The purpose of a good education is simple. It should enable a child to become the author of the story of their life. May will be missed, and the fact that she straddles right across the different aspects of this panel just shows you the gigantic woman that she was. I'm still heavily embedded in the Shankills, either for sins in a previous life or more likely for sins in this life, I think. And so I haven't got to the age yet of having perspective on things. I have a wee bit to go, but I do want to take you a fast trip through the 70s, 80s and 90s, and stay there in the 90s for a wee while and then leave it with you without perspective. This is a story from inside the Shankill, because the 1970s for me, and it is a personal story, we're very wrapped up in community action on the Shankill. And I look back, and those that were about then and that would remember it, the process of redevelopment in the Shankill and in Belfast, you just go, oh, in God's name, did people live through that mayhem? I call them the other troubles. And I would argue that they impacted on the Shankill and people's lives much more radically than actually the Troubles did. And you look at what happened then, and the Save the Shankill campaign, for example, that was an example of a social movement which did bring change in the Shankill and in what was happening there in planning terms. But the 70s were tied up with that sort of protest thing with community action, I think, largely, for me anyway. And then you moved into the 80s and they were dark. It was a genuinely dark decade. The dark decade because of the Troubles, but a dark decade because of Thatcherism. And you know, large parts of working class areas of Belfast just abandoned, essentially, by government. And, you know, you had a few things happening, like housing associations formed and youth training programs set up. But generally speaking, community development had gone either underground or disappeared. There were no resources, and there were, you know, the job was unfinished of housing and everything else in places like the Shankill. And there was a critical thing happened at the end of the 1980s, in 1989, 87 to 89, and that was the setting up of the policy, the British government policy of targeting social need. Now, we know under Roy Mason it was part of a counterinsurgency thing, but it was the third leg of a stool from security to try and get politics going, and then having this targeting of social need. And it was predicated on the basis that the areas of the greatest violence were the areas where the greatest need, social need was. And they were scared by what was happening in the mid-1980s with the rise of Sinn Féin and so forth. But nevertheless, targeting social need and making Belfast work by 1989 for the first time had put money on the table for things to happen, for projects to happen. And I think it was an important and significant development. And it allowed communities in Belfast and in the Shankill and elsewhere through targeting social need to begin thinking of what they could do creatively in their communities. And also in the Shankill, what we did very quickly, because we set up a number of programs of work with Argyll Business Centre being built and some advanced factories and so forth. And you sort of were thinking, can we turn a bit of a corner here? And then we realised that the 35 years of decline was not going to be fixed by a few good projects, no matter how big or good they were, that it needed a strategy. And I think we were the first community actually to begin thinking of 35 years ahead and saying if it's taken that long for us to go into the desperate decline that we're in, it's going to take a long way and a long time and a long commitment to build back. And as a result of that, things that had been set up like the Greater Shankill Development Agency and the Shankill Women's Centre during that period and a whole host of other things that had come through the 80s, the housing associations and so forth, into the 1990s, those had been setting, and these things started to happen, and people began thinking strategically. And, by 1991, I mean, my mind goes to a conference that was held down, I'm trying to remember where it was. That's a comment in itself. I was there, but not fully remembering it, but Community Development Protestant Areas, which was a very, very, very significant conference. A year later, a conference on the Shankill called Beyond the Fife and Drum, this little booklet Michael Hall had produced a record of it, that brought into the same room Ian Paisley and David Irvine, John Taylor and Aris Robinson and so forth, and then poets and community people like Gerald Daw. You couldn't hold a conference like that now with that title, Beyond the Fife and Drum, because it's about all that people are thinking about in many ways in the Shankill, apart from how to get through the day with the way that poverty is at the moment. But there were those springs of things that were beginning to happen to open stuff up, even though the Troubles were in their awful, awful death throes in those last 3 or 4 years in the early 1990s through to the ceasefires. And you had an organisation, in my terms, set up in '92, Springboard, that was working with young people, Shankill, Falls, Tala in Dublin on a cross-border, cross-community basis, and bringing young people together from all those communities. I mean, on the Shankill, when the Shankill bomb went off in 1993, those young people were meeting right opposite where that happened in the office, the rooms that they were meeting in, they couldn't go back into on the Monday because they'd been blown apart. So there was amazing things starting to happen at that period in civil society and from my end in community terms, in community development terms, in working class areas, and supported by those things like the Ulster People's College and the Community Foundation, or NICFA and the Northern Ireland Voluntary Trust at the time. And it was at that point when the build-up to this, including, and I should have mentioned there was Andy and Marion here, the Opsal Commission in 1991, which was the other big feature, I believe, of that year and should never be underestimated, the impact and the space that it allowed for people both to have a voice but also to think. So by 1994, I believe the ground had been set, and I would tend to argue that it was community action and civil society that you're hearing from others that actually kept, during those dark, dark days of the Troubles, before the ceasefires, that kept hope, that kept issues alive, that kept possibility alive. And yes, that kept politics alive when there was with a small p, when there was no politics really happening with a capital P. It kept it alive during those dark days, and it should not be underestimated, the role that it played in creating the possibility and contributing to the ceasefires and then to the Good Friday Agreement, because it opened up an amazing 4 years, and there was something of I can't pronounce it right necessarily, but a zeitgeist that was happening at that time beyond Northern Ireland, but internationally, you know, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and other peace initiatives happening in South Africa and apartheid coming down. There was all these things beginning to happen internationally, and people coming into play that had an interest beyond their own patch, like President Clinton, who were reaching out. And there was something that then began to move within Northern Ireland and within communities there. And I mean, I just remember in 1995 rather, which was like a year, you know, in a way it was a halcyon year for us on the Shankill, you know. The Greater Shankill Partnership was formed, taking up this picture of having a strategic view of regeneration, that it wasn't a quick fix, that it was going to be a 35, but outlining the possibilities of it happening against some community opposition who wanted to retain a grievance mentality and didn't want to talk about a bright and possible future and the possibility of change. But reinforcing that sort of regeneration strategy was, you know, visits, and these were important. Don't underestimate these. That year in June, Prince Charles visited the Shankill, I'm sure against some of his advisors' better judgment. And then later we had Bill Clinton walking up the Shankill. Those things made statements to the people of the Shankill that they were important, that they were not forgotten, that they were part of this emerging picture. And it's very important to have that. And that in an area like the Shankill and within unionism and loyalism at the moment, whatever you think of it, is something that is not happening from outside. It is something where people are being lectured and talked down to, rightly or wrongly, whatever your view. That does not help us to move forward. So my point is that, and I will finish with this, is that moving to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, we had all of this happening on the ground over a number of decades. Some of the words that Bronagh used, some of it was overt. Some of it was overt happening. Some of it on a cross-community basis about politics, about other things was overt. Some of those conferences were overt, like Beyond the Fife and Drum and others. Some of it was covert, and a lot of it was happening under the radar and has not been written about. But so much of it was subliminal. So much of it was implied of what it was happening when you reach out. It was implied that there is a better future here and that ought to be a possibility. Why was that able to happen? Why was all of that able to happen during the dark days of the Troubles? There was the space for it to happen. That space was not inhabited by paramilitaries because they were off fighting a war. It was not inhabited by politicians because they couldn't get their act together. And it created a possibility of people in civil society entering that space to try and make things better and to take forward the issues that concern people. That space began to be closed down once the ceasefires were declared, the Good Friday Agreement happened. Paramilitaries began, some of them, to engage in community development, and you would then have to ask about the term community development in this context. I, for one, argued with paramilitaries on the Shankill through the dark days of the Trouble that they were fighting the wrong war and that they ought to be involved in these issues and social issues. You need to be careful for what you wish for sometimes. But, you know, it is welcoming that these people have moved in many ways to the community field, but it has changed that field of play. It has changed that field of play because I believe that very often the war that was fought physically before that has now become some sort of cultural war that is going on. And the notion of having a conference that's actually looking beyond the fife and drum now would not be something that would go down terribly well at the moment. So how do we create the space for this to happen? because the paramilitaries have moved into a lot of the community space, not totally, but in many instances they have. And then the politics, while it isn't actually happening, the politics has changed the relationship between community organisations and the political establishment. And that is something that is now a significant factor in that sort of transactional world that we live in. And I would hold that we need to create space again for civic society to happen. I attended a big conference in the Waterfront Hall back somewhere about 1995. Mo Mullen was still the Secretary of State, so that would probably place it somewhere. And there had been an executive formed or was forming, and David Trimble and Seamus Mallon were on the platform. It was a world conference about young people all over the world in the Waterfront Hall. It was a big, big deal, some world conference or other. And I remember being in the audience for part of it because I was going to be on a panel. And those political leaders saying to civic leaders that their day had gone and that for the politicians their day had come. And they referred to those civic leaders as the good and the great. Those were the good and great people that held society together here while the politics and the politicians were off fighting with each other. We need to find a space. I could join about a thing here, you could see it, but of John Paul Lederach, of a triangle. And what we need to do is have a triangle which at the top of it you have the political class, and they need to be there. And then you have civic society in the middle, and at the bottom of the triangle here you have the people. And there needs to be communication, you know, horizontally across that triangle. Politicians deal with politicians and civic society getting together in a much better way than it's doing at the moment, and also the communities. But it also critically needs communication up and down, where representative democracy is not seen, or where participative democracy is not seen as a threat to representative democracy. Thanks very much.
And we have Tom Gillen is going to close in terms of the presentations. Tom has dedicated his life to ridding Northern Ireland of sectarianism, particularly in the workplace. In that way, he forged a very practical path to peace, and he did it through his membership of the trade union movement, which ran and participated in many campaigns to make work a place for everyone to find dignity, respect and equality of opportunity, most recently with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. His leadership secured a trade union movement that was not only interested in and protective of members' rights, but of the health and well-being of society as a whole. And he fought discrimination beyond the traditional sectarianism that we might have experienced here. And one shining example, and I remember this, was January 2004, when Tom said publicly that trade unionists were disturbed and angry at the recent spate of attacks on ethnic minorities, and made clear that support for a rally was a clear expression of, and I quote, disgust at racist attacks and absolute support for the human rights of people of all nations. Now that's something that I think we all need to just remind ourselves of again today, that it's not just sectarianism, it's not just the peace process, but it's also all those other people we share our society with. So, Tom, thank you.
Hello everyone. I want to thank the organisers of this event for allowing people from the trade union movement to come along, and it's very interesting with four trade unionists sitting here, maybe even 5, I don't know, but it's interesting. I've been following recent developments of the 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement, and this is the first event where there has been a dedicated space for someone from the trade union movement to say something. We've been a whole range of events, and I wondered at some stage, and I had the opportunity last Friday night in a panel in the Linden Hall to ask, did the trade unions actually do anything? At that time, were we there during the troubles in our community? Did we not hold demonstrations? Did we not defend the rights of workers from all communities? And I just wonder, so I won't do justice to that because everyone's been very fluid. I'm going to be a wee bit more mechanical because I want to go through some of the structures of the things that we did. But before I do that, May Blood was a friend of all of ours, you know, when we worked. She was a member of the TAG. But there's one other person I think I feel incumbent on me to mention today who played a very formal role and a formidable role in promoting the role of trade union movement in this whole process, and that's the late Terry Carlin. And I think we should remember Terry today as well. Okay, so just a brief, I joined the trade union movement in 1964. It was almost 60 years ago. And I joined in short. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions was welcomed into society by the government of the day then in Northern Ireland to celebrate my joining of the trade union movement in the same year. So that was, as I say, I served my time in Shorts, and it was an interesting time because Shorts, and as an industry itself, was a microcosm of our community. I think there were about 100 apprentices in the year that I went in, and 3 of us were saved Catholics or were Catholics. And that, you know, I was already said about our own union, the T&G, would have been 75%, you know, from the Protestant community. My union, which was an engineering union, would have been closer to 90% from that community. And that was the nature of industry at that time. During the 80s, if you were male Catholic, you were 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed than if you were a male Protestant. So that has changed. Things have moved on. But there was, we haven't talked too much about sectarianism, but there was sectarianism, and there was sectarianism in the place where I worked. And during the 12th of July, there would have been parades on the factory floor, there would have been bunting. Those are things that the trade union movement had to grasp and to deal with. Marianne Elliott was talking earlier about an area of North Belfast. I lived in that area, and I don't know if you remember me walking around the White City with you when you were doing some research for your book. But I live in the Longlands, and there's people there. We played together, you know, all year round. But when it came to a certain time of the year, they sort of moved away, and you didn't spend that much time with them anymore. And that area of Belfast suffered an awful lot. And I just want to give context, because there were an awful lot of murders in that part of town. And I saw friends of mine, what they couldn't put on the end of a shovel into a plastic bag, they hosed off the wall. That was the sort of things that we were going through. And that's what the trade union movement has tried to prevent and to work against. Now, as early as 1966, the trade union movement, the Northern Ireland Committee, along with the Northern Ireland Labour Party, put a joint memorandum to the then Northern Ireland government, led by Terence O'Neill at the time. It covered, one of the key things we talked about was that we paid the same taxes and got the same benefits as people in the other part of the United Kingdom and GB. Yet we didn't have the same rights. We didn't have the franchise. We didn't have the right to vote. You know, we had seats in the universities. We had votes based on how much you paid in your rates. The Belfast Harbour Commission, Paddy Devlin, brought us to our attention that if you paid a certain number of rates, you'd have more votes for electing the harbour commissioners at the time. And those were some of the issues that the trade union movement was trying to tackle at that time, to get that universal franchise and representation on public bodies. In response, we met, the Northern Ireland Committee at that time met on the 6th of December 1966 with Brian Faulkner, William Craig, Fitzsimons and Morgan, who were 4 of the local ministers. And in response to one of the arguments put forward, Brian Faulkner said, "We feel the rights of citizens are no less extensive in Northern Ireland than in England, but that the method of exercising these rights should have regard to local needs." Now, I'm going to let you think about what the local needs of Northern Ireland were that people couldn't all have a vote. So I'll leave that one there. So the trade union movement itself then decided that it had a role to play in civic society, and in 1976 brought about the Better Life for All campaign. And this campaign was designed to get security of employment and well-paid work. It agreed with free association and good housing and social services for all, including the aged, old people like myself. You know, we need to do something for them as well. And we wanted to get rid of sectarianism. So that was our first effort in relation to the Better Life for All campaign. Hands Off My Mate, and I'm not taking these in any chronological order, Hands Off My Mate, which was by our young people in the trade union movement, was something that was, they mirrored what was going on in Europe. And Tony McMullen's here, who was instrumental in that. And that was one of the best campaigns that the trade union movement brought forward, recognised by the press at the time. And I'm conscious of the time here, so I'm trying to cut this short. May Day parade taking place on Saturday, and we'll have Mick Lynch here. Just a bit of advertising there. I hope some of you will be able to get along to that. And the May Day started off as just a march, but now it's a real festival. It reaches out to the community, and it's trying to be much more inclusive. And that's sort of the things that we did.
I know we're fast approaching lunch, but I do think, particularly for Tom, I wonder if we could just have one question and maybe...
I'd just like to ask Tom, Tom's been basically talking about the formal trade union movement. You had the less formal local trades council structure. Would it be fair to say that many of the local trades councils stuck their head above the parapet on many issues, possibly, if I remember rightly at the time, to the embarrassment of some of the trade union head offices?
Trades councils were the Belfast Trades Council, Derry Trades Council, they were instrumental in working within their local communities and fighting sectarianism. They played a sterling role in promoting that. The May Day parade itself in Belfast, they played a big part in that. They're still there, and they're still doing that work. And yes, trades councils were to the fore. I couldn't imagine the Day of Unifying Peace, which was held as well throughout Northern Ireland, where we did work. I would have wanted to talk about the Group of Seven as well, where we came together with the employers, and we visited Drumcree. We worked behind the scenes. Many a time, I had many meetings with Gussie Spence and David Irving and the Raven Club. All things that were that back network that you were talking about, Jackie. And Jackie made a very good point at the end when he said about who's moving into community work. We were involved in the European peace funding. I take the view that a lot of that money was used to institutionalise the vision, you know, and that it equipped people to stay apart more than come together. Because Jackie's talking about what happened in Shankill. He hasn't been able to tell us too much about what the linkages were across the communities. And I think a lot of that money was wasted. You know, that's another issue.
We have another one here.
Hi, I'm Tony McMullen, and as Tom mentioned, I was the chair of the Youth Committee of Congress in the early 80s and early to mid 80s, and we had our Hands Off My Mate campaign. It was a campaign that was focused on trying to bring young people together and trying to stand against sectarianism. We went into government training centres, which then were almost exclusively one side of the community. I remember going into Dundonald Government Training Centre, where we had hundreds of young, all exclusively Protestant young workers, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, and we tried to explain to them about sectarianism. And after they laughed at us and tried to get us out of the place, it was very interesting that some of them were prepared to listen to what we had to say, and we were actually talking on very basic terms about what they would do if a friend of theirs was from another religion, and none of them had ever talked to a Catholic in their entire life, or none of them had ever met a Catholic in their entire life, and the same was reflected when we went to government training centres on the other side. We ran seminars away at education centres for weekends. We brought young people together to talk about sectarianism and to talk about building a better future. We ran a number of very successful Rock Against Sectarianism concerts, which again was to try and get young people involved with music. And we deliberately decided to work very closely with the students' union movement in Northern Ireland to try to get over. So it was all very successful. We had very limited resources, but our view was that if we were able to change the mind of one young person and set them on the road of anti-sectarianism, then that was a success. Could I very briefly just say, before I close, that I welcome what was said at the start about us being here among friends that we haven't seen for some time. I was very pleased to see Damien Gorman. I haven't spoken to Damien for 38 years, since I was at his house in then Grey Abbey. And even further than that, 44 years ago, I was a friend of Andy Pollock's when Andy was the chair of the Anti-Nazi League in Belfast, when we had the rise of the National Front in Britain and they were trying to get into schools in Northern Ireland. I was the secretary of the Anti-Nazi League at 21. That gives my age away now. And Andy was the chair. I haven't spoken to Andy for 44 years. Delighted to see the back of your head. Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Could I just ask Tom to say something about that group of 7?
I was just going to come on to that, actually. I thought we'd maybe give
was,
Tom the last word.
It was an example of civic society coming together. Can you remember, not all, but some who were in it, organising Tom?
Well, I think the one person who we owe a great debt of gratitude to was George Quigley, who chaired that group. He chaired it in the most fair manner, a most well-balanced manner. And I would have said that there were 6 business organisations and that they only needed one Irish Congress of Trade Unions. And I think there was that measure, that group of 7 reached out. It met with all of the political parties who were in the Assembly at the time. It lobbied internationally as well. There's another person in the audience here today who was heavily involved in that group of 7, and it talked a lot about prosperity and the economy progressing. And that person always, every time that was mentioned, said, but we want jobs as well. So growth in the economy was good, but we also wanted well-paid jobs. So yeah, the group of 7 it was an example of how people could work together. And one thing I should say, that the civic forum failed because I think local politicians didn't want it to work. We had much more progress with direct road ministers and much more access to government. On Friday night, a Sinn Féin ex-minister said to me that they were working hard to get trade unions through the door, but the other political parties wouldn't let them. And I think civic society is seen as a threat, and local politicians don't particularly. They think politics is only for them, and that working in the community is only for them as well. And I think that's another issue, and I think you touched on that at the end.
No, I absolutely agree, and with Jackie's point, the space was easier there. I remember Ian Paisley having a go at civic society when they wanted to boycott British ministers, but civil society were having meetings because we were doing the ordinary policy business. And in fact, he had to kind of backtrack because there was such public support on behalf of civil society. But I think that the squeezing of the space for civil society, and I think you can see that in the fact that the Civic Forum was suspended with the First Assembly and never resurrected, but it was intended to be that kind of economic and social forum space at that time to help politicians think ahead of the future instead of being stuck just in the political battles. I think that we're in quite a difficult stage at the moment. And I know there are people here from grassroots communities who are suffering under the yoke of paramilitarism. You know, it's almost like a mini Mexico here with the gross violations of paramilitaries. I have to say, particularly in loyalist areas, and then we have the Republican dissidents on the other side. It's something that we have to deal with as a community, but if we had that active civic society, I think we were being engaged in it better. I'm not opposed to those former paramilitaries and prisoners who've actually converted and turned over and been engaged in the last 25 years. But there's very clearly a tranche of people who haven't, who have groomed more young people, who are actually exploiting people left, right and centre. And what is very dangerous is that two things. First of all, I remember Avila and I being asked to address a meeting where there were former paramilitaries, where people were encouraging them to get into politics. And I was quite blunt. I said, not unless things are transformed. I haven't spent the last 20 years trying to get more diversity, and particularly more women in politics, just to get men who are untransformed, former guns, coming into that arena. And the second thing is, they always get money to transform. If people haven't transformed in 25 years, they're not going to. We should be investing the money in the youth organisations and in the women's groups and in the civil society organisations and really creating more space for civil society to get back to what civil society was.
As a member of the Civic Forum, it didn't fail. It was closed down. It was closed down by a direct rule minister. Civic Forum itself argued that there were other institutions, the Good Friday Agreement, that were still functioning, even though the Assembly was down. The point was, they said, well, the Civic Forum advises the Assembly it couldn't continue, but it was never reconvened after the Assembly came back. And the politicians, quite rightly, as I said from speakers on the platform, said regularly that it was their job. And there was also an element of the civil service who also said it was their professional job to advise ministers, and therefore civic society really should just go away. Peace was delivered.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that. Now, the purpose of today is to bring everyone together, so I want you to be able to use up your whole lunch break to catch up with old friends and chat about what we've seen this morning. So.